Well, a very good evening to everybody. Thank you for coming to. Hello, Dave. Very lovely to have everybody here, particularly our brother Roger and sister Pauline, who've travelled so far to be with us tonight. It was 15 years ago when a straggling group of 14 brothers and sisters leapt out into northwestern Hunter region in Kurri and started the Hunter Valley adventure. There's, I think, 6 of us left. We did have 7, but Brother Mike has now transferred to Adelaide. So 6 foundation members left, and now we have an Ecclesia that's somewhere in the mid-90s by number. And our latest member, of course, is the head of the Roger Lewis fan club all the way from New Zealand, Kate Reid. She's our latest member as of last Sunday. Thank you for turning up to make Uncle Roger feel special, Kate. This is a bit of an early opener as far as anniversaries go. Normally we start on a Saturday, but it's a bit of an epic anniversary. We're doing tonight 2 talks on Saturday, 3 on Sunday, and another one for the young people, which is the perfect number 7, of course. And it's fairly epic, not quite as epic as the College of the Prophets, if I remember correctly, back in 2008, when it was a 3-week affair with Brother Roger, Brother Michael Ashton, Brother John Martin. This anniversary won't be going for 3 weeks, but it will be going for 3 days. Epic nonetheless. So tonight we're starting our series under the general theme of inspiring characters, portraits of faithful men and women. Tonight we're looking at why Obed Edom was blessed. So we'll commence with a hymn and prayer. Well, to introduce our subject, why was Obed Edom blessed? We're going to take a reading from 1 Chronicles 13, verse 6 to 14. And I'd ask our brother Roy Galbraith to come forward and read that for us. 1 Chronicles 13, verse 6 to 4. Well, thank you very much, Brother Roy, for that reading. And I'd now like to hand over to our brother Roger Lewis, who's going to talk to us about why Obed Edom was blessed. And I'll leave Brother Roger on the floor.
Well, thank you, Brother Chairman, and good evening, my dear brothers and sisters in our Lord Jesus Christ, and my dear young people. Well, what a stirring start. Do you know, there are so many Bible characters that are so intriguing in the divine record. The thing that amazes me is that somehow, in the wisdom of God, the Spirit paints enough detail so that we feel that we've come to know each of these people, come to draw close to them, come to understand the secret of their lives. And that, God willing, is the purpose of our gathering over the course of these next few days, to look at just a few people in Scripture, to ponder what it is that the Spirit says about them and what it is that we might learn from them that will be helpful for our own walk in the truth towards the kingdom of God. Do you know this story, 1 Chronicles 13, when you think about it, it's really a study in contrast, isn't it? Because 2 men stood in relation to the ark of God. But in the one, his association brought about his death. And in the other, his association enriched his life. So the breach of Obed Edom were polar opposites in the same story, in the same chapter. And that difference can only be explained by something about their own attitude to the truth and to God that was fundamentally different. The breach of Uzzah was a tragedy because a man was struck down by God, the journey of the ark was disrupted, and the king of Israel was left afraid. And in his uncertainty, we read in this chapter, do we not, that David took the ark of God aside to place it temporarily, says verse 13, into the house of Obed Edom the Gittite. Now, what's interesting about that man and that name is this. It's been suggested, be careful before you write too many notes. It's been suggested that the term Gittite here refers to Gath Rimmon. a city of the Levites and of the Kohathites in particular. So J.J. Blunt, in a book Undesigned Coincidences of the Bible, which some of you may have read or possess, suggests that that was the case. And based on Joshua chapter 21, verse 24, telling us that Gath-Rimmon was indeed one of the cities given to the Kohathites, he suggested that the reason why Obed Edom was blessed is because he was a Kohathite, and they should have been bearing the ark of God anyway, and David learned that lesson. And since we see in the next chapter or two in Chronicles that David says, none but the Levites ought to carry the ark of God, for them hath God chosen, we come to the conclusion that perhaps that's a good inference. But there's another explanation, which I think in its fullness may provide an even more powerful lesson from this story, and one which we can personally take great comfort and encouragement from. And that interpretation rests on the identification of Obed Edom as a Gentile and not a Jew, which fundamentally, dramatically alters the significance of this passage. Now, here's the thing, brothers and sisters and young people. There are at least three places in the scripture called Gath. There was Gath-Hepher in Zebulun. We're told that in the 2nd of Kings 14, verse 25. There was a Gath-Rimmon in Dan. We're told that in Joshua 21, verses 23 and 24. And there was a Gath-Philistia in Judah, which is referred to in the 1st of Samuel, chapter 7 and verse 14. In fact, that last one is the most famous, the most well-known of all the Gaths, Gath of Philistia. So when we come to the term Gittite, which incidentally does mean inhabitant of Gath, well, then it's the context that should decide for us which Gath might be being referred to. And that's where it gets interesting. Because in every other use of the term Gittite in Scripture, it refers without exception to Gath of Philistia, to the Gath of the Philistines. Now, come and have a look at them, because there's not many. In the book of Joshua, chapter 13, it says this. Here we are traversing the length and breadth of the scriptural passages where the term Gittite is used, so that we might come to our own conclusion. Joshua 13, verse 3 says, Joshua was old and well stricken in years. It says, this is all the land that remains. Verse 2, the borders of the Philistines. So he says in verse 3, from Sihor, which is before Egypt, even unto the border of Ekron northward, which is counted to the Canaanites. And then he says, the 5 lords of the Philistines, the Gazathites, and the Ashtathites, and the Eshkelonites, the Gittites, and the Ekronites. Now, the Gittite, the phrase Gittite in Joshua 13, verse 3, can only refer to Gath of Philistia. It's one of the 5 cities of the Philistine lords. Gittite. That's Gath of Philistia. If you come to the 2nd of Samuel in chapter 15, do you remember that moment when David had to flee the city of Jerusalem because Absalom was revolting? We're told this in the 2nd of Samuel chapter 15, these words, verse 18. When the king decided to finally leave the city, the record says, verse 18, and all his servants passed on beside him, and all the Cherethites and all the Pelethites. Oh, let's just stop there. Who were the Cherethites and the Pelethites? Answer, they were David's elite troops, but they were of Philistine. And then on top of those Philistines, it says, and all the Gittites, 600 men which came after him from Gath, passed on before the king. Now, those Gittites that joined his Philistine bodyguard were clearly from Gath of Philistia. Now, in the same chapter, in the 19th verse, it says, then said the king to Ittai the Gittite. Now, that's one of David's 3 army captains. Well, he also was a Gittite, and he's of Philistine origin. His brethren were Philistines. And so he was a man of Gath from Philistia. It's going to say later on in that chapter in verse 20 that David says to Ittai, whereas thou camest but yesterday, should I this day make thee go up and down with us? Seeing I go whither I may, return thou and take back thy brethren. And the brethren he was to take back were the 600 Gittites that had come with him in verse 18. Now, these are references to the Gittite who belonged to Gath of Philistia. And one last passage just a few chapters further on, in the 2nd of Samuel chapter 21, in the story of the battles that David engaged in. 2nd of Samuel 21 and verse 19 says, "And there was again a battle in Gob with the Philistines, where Elhanan, the son of Jerah-oregim, a Bethlehemite, slew the brother of Goliath the Gittite." The brother of Goliath the Gittite. Now, what Gittite would that be, or what Gath do you think that would be? That's got to be Gath of Philistia. That's where Goliath and his brothers came from. Now, that's every other reference to the word Gittite that we have, brothers and sisters, apart from this one back in the 1st Chronicles 13. Let's come back to 1st Chronicles 13. So when it says in the 1st Chronicles 13 these words, and in verse 13, "So David brought not the ark home to himself to the city of David, but carried it aside into the house of Obed Edom the Gittite," the weight of scriptural evidence behind that term would indicate that he was by birth Philistine. And yet it was into the house of this man that David brought the ark in his time of crisis. David obviously knew Obed Edom. It was probably the king's friendship that had brought this man into the truth. In fact, one of the remarkable things about David, he was like Abraham. He had a capacity that somehow, wherever he went, he brought people into the truth. He was one of those sorts of people. Talk to others. Next minute, they're in the truth. Well, David did. In fact, when you come to the list of David's mighty men, we're told this in the 1st Chronicles. We shan't turn it up. But 1st Chronicles 11, verse 39 tells us that among David's mighty men were Zelek the Ammonite, verse 41, Uriah the Hittite, verse 46, Ithmar the Moabite. These are all David's mighty men. He brought all these Gentiles into the covenant of Israel. So there was nothing strange about his friendship and association with Obed Edom the Philistine from Gath, Obed Edom the Gittite. David was always making friends with whoever he came into contact. In fact, do you know, I think that there's a moment in David's life where he probably met Obed Edom. Come and have a look in the 1st of Samuel, chapter 27. I think this was the moment where perhaps the two men met, you see, because you might remember earlier on in David's fugitive years, we're told this in the 1st of Samuel, chapter 27, and reading from verse 2. First of Samuel 27, verse 2 says, "David arose and passed over with the 600 men that were with him unto Achish, the son of Maok, king of Gath. And David dwelt with Achish at Gath." And verse 4 says, "It was told Saul that David was fled to Gath, and he sought no more again for him." And then it says in verse 7, "And the time that David dwelt in the country of the Philistines was a full year and 4 months." So the Gath that we're talking about here in the 1st of Samuel 27 is Gath of Philistia, is it not? Definitely Gath of Philistia. And David stayed there, says the record, for, why, a full year and 4 months. And when he left that place, we're told in the 2nd of Samuel 15, 600 men from Gath went with David, left Gath and joined David. And I suggest that among those who probably joined him on that occasion when he departed from Gath was Obed Edom the Gittite, you see. But although Obed Edom might have come from there, he obviously didn't live there anymore. I think we can be certain of that because Gath of Philistia, is many, many miles away from the road between Kirjath-Jearim and Jerusalem where the ark was being taken. There was no way that he would have taken the ark all the way back down to Gath. No, Obed Edom doesn't live in Gath anymore. He's now left his old way of life down on the Philistine plain. And he's living up on the hills of the Judean plateau. So coming back to Chronicles, brothers and sisters, you see, I think we can be confident that It was providence that the breach of Uzzah occurred at the threshing floor of Kidon. And it was providence that David already knew Obed Edom as a Gentile proselyte. And it was providence that his house was close to the place where the oxen had stumbled. See, David couldn't just turn aside and lodge the ark at the first house he could find. Given the disaster that had occurred, given that he was fearful of the anger of Yahweh, he was anxious that he would place that ark into the care of someone who could be absolutely trusted, don't you think? And right there, near at hand, was a man he knew personally who was an example of extraordinary faithfulness before God. He might have been a Philistine by birth, but by spirit, he was an Israelite indeed, this man, Obed Edom. David thankfully said, shall I place the ark here in the meantime? Verse 14 says, in the first of Chronicles, chapter 13, verse 14 says, and the ark of God remained with the family of Obed Edom in his house 3 months. Yahweh blessed the house of Obed Edom and all that he had. Samuel record says that Yahweh blessed Obed Edom and all his household. So question, why? Why was his family and his whole household blessed? It can't have simply been because the ark came to rest in his house. The mere depositing of the ark wasn't the key, was it, to the divine blessing? It was his attitude to it. It was his standard of reverence. It was his spirit of devotion. It was his sense of guardianship. There was something about Obed Edom that made him the right person to look after the ark at this critical moment. This man who was so intent on preserving the sacred trust of the Ark of the Presence that he became momentarily its protector and defender. And clearly, to the delight of Yahweh Elohim of Israel, there was no breach here. No breach with the ark being in the house of Obed Edom, only a faithful keeping of the threshold of the sanctuary, which for this brief moment, for just 3 months, resided in his house. And if we were to ask in what way do you think Obed Edom was blessed, it doesn't say here in Chronicles, does it? In what way he was blessed. But I think we can make an assumption now and prove it later. If you come to the book of Psalms, do you remember that wonderful psalm that's written about having lots of children? Olive plants and tables. Now, where is that psalm? It's the 128th psalm. It's in the midst of the Songs of Degrees. It's a psalm, actually, that talks about blessing. And the blessing the psalm talks about is the fruitfulness of children. And so Psalm 128 says, reading from the very first verse, blessed is everyone that feareth Yahweh, that walketh in his ways. For thou shalt eat the labour of thine hands, happy shalt thou be, and it shall be well with thee. Thy wife shall be as a fruitful vine by the sides of thine house, thy children like olive plants round about thy table. Behold, that thus shall the man be blessed that feareth Yahweh. Yahweh shall bless thee out of Zion. In what way was this man to be so thoroughly blessed? Well, it goes on to say, thou shalt see the good of Jerusalem all the days of thy life. Yea, thou shalt see thy children's children, and peace upon Israel. You see, the blessing, at least proposed in measure by the 128th Psalm, is the sign of the blessing of children and the increase of the household. And I think what we're being told back in Chronicles, when we're told that the house of Obed Edom was blessed, the whole household of Obed Edom was blessed, is that they may well have been multiple conceptions in his family at this time. That whatever happened, there were signs already evident within the cycle of 3 moons that Yahweh had prospered his family, as we shall later discover. So the Samuel record says, and it was told King David, saying, Yahweh hath blessed the house of Obed Edom and all that attaineth unto him. That sign, you see, that blessing that came upon Obed Edom and his family was the stimulus to faith that David needed to complete his work, because he now knew how badly he'd strayed from the divine standard, a thing that Yahweh could not and would not permit. But the blessing of God upon Obed Edom told David this. It told David that it wasn't the matter of the movement of the ark to Zion that brought God's disapproval. It was the manner of its carriage. Do you know, I think there were two different Obed Edoms involved in the second attempt, the right attempt to bring the ark up to Zion. And I think that one of them was Obed Edom the Gittite. Now, just come 2 chapters on into the First of Chronicles chapter 15, and just see what the record says about this second endeavour of David now that was successful in finally bringing the ark of God to Zion. Because we're going to find the name Obed Edom turning up again, and I think that one of the men in this chapter, second of First of Chronicles 15, is the man of our study. Now, do you notice firstly what it says in First of Chronicles 15, verse 17? It says, so the Levites appointed Heman the son of Joel and of his brethren, Asaph the son of Berechiah, and of the sons of Merari their brethren, Ethan the son of Cushai. So here's the 3 great Levitical branches. Kohath, Gershon, and Merari each had a key singer, a chief singer, 3 key singers that led all of the musical choirs of that temple age. And now verse 18 says, but there were others with them, other brethren, described here as the brethren of a second degree. They were subordinate to the 3 main choir leaders. And now it lists their names. And right at the end of that verse, verse 18, towards the end it says, and Obed Edom and Jeiel the porters. So here's an Obed Edom who's a Levite. He's part of the second degree of those that were associated with the musical choirs. And he's going to turn up again in 2 more verses, because we're told in verse 21, it says, and Mattathiah, and Eliphalet, and Micneiah, and Obed Edom, and Jeiel, and Azaziah, with harps on Sheminith to excel. Now, the Obed Edom of verse 21, brothers and sisters, is the Obed Edom of verse 18, who's a Levite. You can tell this by looking at the names. He's there playing on a harp, and he's a Levite. He's not the man of our story, but there's another Obed Edom who will turn. Because we see what it says now in verse 23. Where the ark was actually being carried, there were 2 porters in front of the ark. Verse 23, Berechiah and Elkanah. But at the back of the ark, at the end of verse 24, it says, and Obed Edom and Jehiah were also porters or doorkeepers for the ark at the back of the ark, and around the ark, most probably, there were 7 priests blowing trumpets, as it says in the middle of verse 24. So you've got a whole procession. 2 porters at the front, the priests blowing the trumpets around the ark, 2 porters walking behind it. One of the porters that walks behind it is called Obed Edom. Now, which Obed Edom do you think that might be? Well, I think it's the man that's referred to in verse 25. When it says, so David and the elders of Israel and the captains of thousands went to bring up the ark of the covenant of Yahweh out of the house of Obed Edom. And I think that the Obed Edom that marched behind the ark as one of the 2 porters guarding it was Obed Edom the Gittite. Think about how appropriate that might have been for David to salute the integrity and the faithfulness of his friend by asking him to become a porter behind the ark from the very moment it left his home. And because it was Obed Edom's faithfulness that made possible this joyful day of bringing the ark at last to Zion, do you think there was anyone in Israel who would have challenged the presence of Obed Edom the Gittite to be associated with the things of that day? Who would have dared to suggest that he shouldn't be involved? He'd saved the nation from disaster for the past 3 months. Oh yes, I think that man is Obed Edom the Gittite. And I think there's a reason why we might imagine that too, because whoever it was, this man that was asked to walk behind the ark by David into Jerusalem was asked by David when he got there to stay with that ark in Jerusalem. It's over the page in 1 Chronicles 16. Here he is again, verse 37. So David left there before the ark of the covenant of Yahweh, Asaph and his brethren, to minister before the ark continually as every day's work required, and Obed Edom with their brethren, 68, colon. And now we've got another Obed Edom mentioned. Obed Edom also the son of Jeduthun and Hosah to be porters. Now, why would the second Obed Edom be mentioned as having a lineage? Obed Edom, the son of Jeduthun. Why does he have to be mentioned by that distinguishing mark? Well, obviously to distinguish him from the first Obed Edom, to make it clear that he's a different man. But the crucial meaning, brothers and sisters, I believe of verse 37 and 38 is that when the ark came to Jerusalem, only one set of singers were asked to stay and sing with the ark in Jerusalem, the house of Asaph. The other singers from the other Levitical choirs didn't stay there. They were all sent off to Gibeon. And all the other porters were sent off to Gibeon. But the house of Obed Edom were asked to stay with the ark in Jerusalem. Now, we know that when we read this record carefully. Because you see what it goes on to say. It says, Zadok the priest, verse 39, his brethren the priests before the tabernacle of Yahweh in the high place that was at Gibeon. Zadok went to Gibeon. The priests went to Gibeon. They offered burnt offering there. And verse 41, the other singers, Heman and Jeduthun, they went to Gibeon. And verse 42 says, and with them Heman and Jeduthun with trumpets and cymbals for those that should make a sound, and with musical instruments of God. And the sons of Jeduthun were porters there in Gibeon. Do you know who the sons of Jeduthun are? The second Obed Edom, in verse 38, Obed Edom, the son of Jeduthun. He's gone to Gibeon. The second Obed Edom's gone to Gibeon. The first Obed Edom never left the side of that ark. He marched behind the ark and he got to Jerusalem, and David said, I want you to stay here. Do you notice that that first Obed Edom in verse 38 has no ancestry given to him? He's simply Obed Edom with his brethren. I think he's mentioned that way, you see, because he didn't have any lineage in the nation of Israel. He was a Gittite, he was a Philistine. It was only in his lifetime that he became associated with the people of Israel. But it was this man whom David trusted, this man whom David sought to watch over the Ark of the Covenant in the tabernacle of David. He became in spirit a Levite. He was a gatekeeper, he was a porter, he was a guardian of the threshold in safeguarding the ark. And you know, I think that there's greater significance to this appointment than we might first realize, because this chapter, the first of Chronicles 16, tells us that there were two tents and two tabernacles. One was the tabernacle of Moses at Gibeon, verse 39, and the other was the tabernacle of David in Zion, verse 1, wherein was a new altar in the ark of God. The first tabernacle in Gibeon stood for the old covenant of the law, and ministering in that place were the singers of Heman and Jeduthun and the porters of Kohath and Merari. But this second tabernacle in Zion, the tabernacle of David, stood for the new covenant and for the worship of Yahweh in spirit and in truth. And only the singers of the house of Asaph were allowed to stand and minister in that place. And who were the porters for the tabernacle of David, where the ark was? The answer is the family of Obed Edom, and only the family of Obed Edom. Now, what an honourable and respected position to hold as a Gentile. So this episode happened when David first brought the ark of God to Zion. But notice now the arrangements for the temple system which David finalised shortly before his death. In fact, he's probably in the last year of his life when he finalises the arrangements that will go forward in the future under Solomon his son, 30 years after the first of Chronicles 16. So see what David's arrangements are about the porters. It's in the first of Chronicles, but this time in chapter 26. And we've only moved a few chapters from chapter 16 to chapter 26. We've moved 10 chapters, brothers and sisters, but we've moved 30 years in David's life. And now this is what it says, 1 Chronicles 26, verse 1. Concerning the divisions of the porters, Meshelemiah. So what we've got in chapter 26, verse 1 is the first set of porters, and by the way, they happen to be Kohathites through the line of Korah, 7 sons of Meshelemiah. And if you come down to verse 9, that grouping ends with these words, verse 9, and Meshelemiah had sons and brethren, strong men, 18. So here's the first great set of porters from the Kohathite branch of Levi. And following on from that in verse 10, we've got another group, and Hosah of the children of Merari had sons, and it counts all those up and says at the end of verse 11, and it says all the sons and brethren of Hosah were 13. So now we've got another set of porters, the Merarites, through the line of Hosah. But in between those two groups of Levitical porters from Kohath and Merari, we have another set identified. And those are the ones described in verse 4, when it says, moreover, the sons of Obed Edom. The sons of Obed Edom. Do you notice it doesn't say the Obed Edom the son of? There's no lineage given, no ancestry. This is the family of Obed Edom the Gittite. This is Obed Edom the Philistine. This is Obed Edom the Gentile. And as we read the list of the names, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, verse 5, Amiel the sixth, Issachar the seventh, Pulthai the eighth, 4. Now just look at these words. For God blessed him. Now where have we come across those words before? That's exactly what it said, didn't it? In the First Chronicles 13, verse 14. And Yahweh blessed the house of Obed Edom and all that he had. Well, here it is, brothers and sisters. And now we know for certain what that blessing was and what it involved. How was Obed Edom marvelously blessed by God? Because his family was multiplied. And we know that they were multiplied because, well, read what it says in verse 8 at the end of that list of Obed Edom's household. All these are the sons of Obed Edom, they and their sons and their brethren, able men for strength for the service, were 62 of Obed Edom. Do you know that in this chapter, there are 93 men listed for the work of porters? 93 men. And out of those 93 men, this one family, the house of Obed Edom, will supply 62 of those men. 2/3 of all the porters will come from this one household, Obed Edom. A Philistine family guarded the special holiness of the house of God and the sacred treasure of the ark in its midst. That's amazing. What an astonishing man he must have been. And all that time, David never forgot the faithfulness of his friend Obed Edom the Gittite by finally joining him, don't you think? Finally joining him to the tribe of Levi, just as Caleb had been adopted into the tribe of Judah. David counted his friend, his Philistine friend, as a Levite. Now, why that's interesting is because there's a remarkable prophecy later on in the Old Testament that seems to talk about this story. The tabernacle of David and the story of Obed Edom. That's Amos chapter 9. You remember? Come on, have a look at Amos chapter 9, because there's a direct link back to the story of what had happened in David's time. Amos 9 says, in verse 11, in that day will I raise up the tabernacle of David that is fallen, and close up the breaches thereof, and I will raise up his ruins, and I will build it as in the days of old, that they may possess the remnant of Edom, which are called by my name, saith the Lord that doeth this. See, Amos saw a time when the nation of Israel would be rebuilt after the judgments of God had come upon them. That's what verses 8 to 10 is all about, the judgments of God to come upon the nation of Israel. But beyond that, after that, says Amos the prophet, there'll be a day coming when Israel will be restored, but that restoration would take in the surrounding nations until all the territory promised to the patriarchs would be completed. And see what it says in verse 12, that they may possess. Now the margin says, or at least my margin says, see Numbers 24, verse 18. And at first sight you think, well, maybe that is the right cross-reference, because Numbers says, and Edom shall be for a possession, Seir also for a possession for his enemies, and Israel shall do valiantly. Do you know, I think that when we read Amos chapter 9 carefully, we realize that what Amos suggests is not so much the possession of conquest as the possession of conversion. The New King James Version says that they may possess the remnant of Edom and all the Gentiles who are called by my name, or literally upon whom my name is called. So he was an Israel who would reach out not so much to conquer and to subjugate as to include and embrace all the nations around her into an Israelitist kingdom, every one of whom would manifest the name of God. And Israel wasn't going to accomplish this. This was the work of God. As it says at the end of the verse 12, Yahweh shall be he that doeth this. So in the prophecy of Amos envisaged in this final chapter a revival of the tabernacle of David to include Gentile believers. But wasn't the cameo for all that an Obed Edom, who as the representative of the heathen became so involved in the cause of the tabernacle of David as to be its faithful guardian, and upon whom the name of Yahweh had been called, to indicate that he was included, counted, deemed to be part of the hope of Israel? How better to symbolize Israel's future possession of the remnant of Edom than David's acceptance of a man who was called the servant of Edom, Obed Edom? Didn't David possess this one in the very best of senses? In that he included Obed Edom in the very work of the holy tribe of the Levites, as if he belonged there. So you see, this prophecy of Amos contained within it a wonderful allusion to the story of Obed Edom the Gittite. And I think we've got every reason to read Amos chapter 9 that way, because we've got the warrant of a New Testament inspired commentary to confirm it. Now, where's that in the New Testament? A New Testament commentary on Amos chapter 9. Well, that's the Jerusalem conference, isn't it, in Acts chapter 15. Now, just come and see how wonderfully James at the Jerusalem conference will take up the spirit of Amos chapter 9 in order to deal with a very, very difficult matter that the Ecclesia of the time was facing in the New Testament era. Perhaps reading from Acts 15 and verse 13, it says, after they had held their peace. Now, incidentally, those that had already spoken were the Pharisees, verse 5, Peter, verse 7, Paul and Barnabas, verse 12, they've all given their information about the call of the Gentiles, how the Gentiles had responded to the call of the truth, how God had been so evidently at work amongst the Gentiles. But when we come to verse 13, what we realize is it was left to James to supply a biblical basis to answer the question of the Jerusalem conference about the salvation of the Gentiles. And the clue to his thinking lay in his words that he says here in verse 14. Simeon hath declared, says James, how God at the first did visit the Gentiles to take out of them a people for his name. And in the words that follow, verse 16, verse 17, and verse 18, you'll probably know that James is going to quote three Old Testament references, one after the other. Jeremiah 12, verses 14 to 16, Amos chapter 9, verses 11 and 12, Isaiah 45, verse 21. But they're all connected to the name of Yahweh, and his key quotation was Amos chapter 9. And so this is what he says. He quotes it. James quotes it. He says, here it is, verse 16. After this I will return and build again the tabernacle of David that's fallen down, and I'll build again the ruins thereof and set it up that the residue of men might seek after the Lord, and all the Gentiles upon whom my name is called, saith the Lord, who doeth all these things. I think what we're being told here in Acts chapter 15 is that what James saw was that whatever ultimate fulfillment the prophecy of Amos might point forward to, that there was an immediate and an appropriate application to his own day, right now, in his time at the conference, which answered the question of, should the Gentiles be included? And the power of Amos lay in declaring that there were Gentiles upon whom the name of God was called, and that it was his sovereign purpose to include them in his plan. And there was no better proof that a Gentile could come unto God than that amazing moment in Israel when a Gittite became a Levite. You want to know whether the Gentiles should be included, says James? Amos 9, the time of David, Obed Edom. Oh, and you know what's really interesting about Acts 15, brothers and sisters? You see, the Jerusalem conference of Acts 15 also sought to address the question, verse 5, of whether those Gentile converts needed to be circumcised. Now, how powerful do you think was James's quotation of Amos 9 when at its heart lay the story of a Gentile, Obed Edom the Gittite, who not only found acceptance at the tabernacle of David, but guarded the ark of God as one who had been an uncircumcised Philistine. Oh, I think the Spirit overshadowed James said that day. I think the Spirit gave to James what he should say that day. And he quoted Amos 9 with all the story of Obed Edom, the Philistine, behind it, as the perfect answer to the challenges of the Jerusalem conference. As those who've been called from among the Gentiles, we, brothers and sisters, how wonderful is the example of Obed Edom to encourage us all. As Peter would say later on in the Acts of the Apostles, of a truth I perceive that God is no respecter of persons, but in every nation he that feareth him and worketh righteousness is accepted with him. Gentiles can be included in the hope of Israel if their spirit's right before God. And their inclusion in God's purpose was a matter of prophecy and scriptural teaching. And perhaps Obed Edom also teaches us that blessing will come to those who reverence the presence of God in their midst. Now, I think of Obed Edom, brothers and sisters, and I think of the words of a hymn. Wherever, Lord, thy people meet, there they behold the mercy seat. Where'er they seek thee, thou art found, and every place is hallowed ground. Obed Edom hallowed his house to receive the ark of God. Just think about that moment, brothers, because it must have been unbelievable. Just to picture what that must have been like. Picture the scene in this house where the ark of God has been brought in. The ark of God, placed in the middle of the lounge. Can you imagine? There's the family and the ark's right in their midst. Wasn't this the ark of God that in earlier times had visited several cities of the Philistines and brought smiting and death wherever it had gone? And now it sits in the house of Obed Edom, the Philistine. How do you think, brothers and sisters, that family would have felt? How would you speak? How would you behave? What would you think? The ark of God's there. In everything in those 3 months, they must have been absolutely conscious of the divine presence. That's the point, isn't it? To see our homes should also be places where the ark of God could be lodged. So how can we do this? How do we make our homes a little sanctuary for the presence of God? Well, I think it happens by observing all the little things that make up a godly house and home. That in that house there should be prayer each day for help, that the purpose of God might be outworked in our lives to the glory of his name. There should be prayers at every meal that we might remember the source of blessings, both spiritual and temporal. Prayers every day for forgiveness, that we might come near the mercy seat and seek its healing power. In that house, the Bible should be read every day, that we might remember the holiness of God and strive to remove the unholy and the profane from our lives. We need to read our scriptures every day to purify the stream of our thinking so that our perspective remains on the truth. There should be in our houses reminders around the home that this is a house for God. Our books, our quotations, our pictures, our displays should include a witness to our hope. Do you know, I'm sure in Australian brethren's houses as much as in New Zealand's, going back a long time, maybe to Grandma and Grandpa's day, there was often a little plaque on the wall in Christadelphian homes. And it just said, up there on the wall, where everyone could see it, Christ is the head of this house, the unseen guest at every meal, the silent listener to every conversation. It was almost as if it was saying, don't you think, the ark of God is in this place. And we need to make our homes like that. Don't you think? See, as Gentiles, we should never take lightly the blessing of being included in the hope of Israel. We should treasure that call by living lives that say that the name of God has been called upon us as well. To never forget the blessing that's been extended to us, that God in his mercy has permitted us, who were part of the remnant of Edom, to draw near unto him. And let's be grateful for the story of a man of whom the scripture would say, and Yahweh blessed the house of Obed Edom, and all that he had.